So thanks for joining once again, and welcome. We're gonna run through a topic that's it's something that's emerged relatively recently as a challenge we're facing, but fast, and really brings the word urgent into it in the sense of how we're going to best deal with the challenge we're faced, the storage provision we're making, and indeed what legislation we need to see there to deal with it. So I'm Jayden from Urban Spec, as many of you will know, and I'm joined by my colleague Nigel from the metroSTOR team, who's going to be running through a lot of the background for us.
Yep. Hello, everyone.
So just as a brief overview and introduction to who we are. Again, I know this will be familiar to some of you, so we'll just cover the background and then start looking into the topic and what's going on. As you will know, we are at Street Space Limited. We have the three brands, metroSTOR and Urban Spec, working similarly in all things bin and cycle storage, just in slightly different areas, I guess. Some Urban Spec being mainly in the new build construction category, metroSTOR looking more at existing refurbishment and housing estates, that type of thing. But it's fair to say, I think, that it's somewhat close to hearts, and we're working with cycle storage all day, every day, and we see these trends in mobility, evolving ultimately with regard to the uptake in light electric vehicles, whether it's scooters, whether it's bikes or whatever. And in that context, we've got really quite a serious threat that we're facing. I think that is the best way to put it. So that's us. The other brand on Street Space Structures deals with something a bit different on all things canopies. So that's just by way of reference and to remind, so to speak, of who we are. So I thought what we'd start with is I'm gonna hand across to Nigel to actually start looking through what's going on now in this challenge, what's happening, where we're at, and why this is a problem. And then we'll start looking at the practical side after that, a bit more on what we should do. So over to you, Nigel. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Jayden. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. I guess for my sins, I've ended up doing quite a lot of research into e-mobility and e-bikes, e-scooters, mobility scooters, as part of the work we do with social housing providers, providing safe storage facilities for them. And as Jayden says, this is a very fast-moving topic or issue, challenge for the sector. Everyone in the built environment responsible for either existing buildings or designing new ones. Just this week, there was a video released as part of the Electrical Safety First campaign, which we'll come to again, which I was going to try and play actually because it sets the scene quite powerfully in terms of exactly what the risk is, and I think that should colour and influence how we deal with this subject going forward.
It was about to be one of the best times of our life. Our little son Oliver was about to finish play school. He was about to go into full-time school. That meant Gemma could finally get a job and we could start actually having a decent life, because ever since Lily was born, Gemma had become a full-time mum, and all our lives were literally about to start, and it just all got snuffed out in a night. Well, I've been working at M&S for coming up to 11 years, and I've been riding to work, doing it in the wind, the rain, the traffic, any sort of condition you could think of. I just thought, our lives are about to get easier now. It's literally just supposed to be a luxury item just to make all our lives easier. If I'd known that it could cause this, I never would have bought it. We were woken in the night by an almighty bang. The floor shaked, the house echoed. By the time I got outside my bedroom, I could see the glow of the fire. There was flames coming up the stairs like a flamethrower. I've never seen anything like it. I was terrified for my children. I knew something had to be done, so I jumped out the window. I told Gemma I'll be back in a minute. I basically got into the back door and the entire hallway was engulfed in flames, and I could just see this massive glow just right above my bike. Everything was on fire. So I ran back out to the back garden and started calling for Gemma and the kids to jump. The last thing I ever heard from my girlfriend was, "We can't get out, we're stuck." I called for her about 2 more times, but I never got an answer from her again. At that point, I collapsed on the floor in tears. I closed my eyes after that, and I woke up 4 weeks later in hospital. I'd been in a coma for 4 weeks. And no one had made it out of the house. And now I've got to live with this fact that, do they know that I helped? Or was the last memory of me, where the hell is Dad? My son was found in his bedroom. My girlfriend was found in the doorway of my bedroom. And my daughter was found under the bed with my dogs. But I can guarantee that in the next couple of years, everyone will know someone who had an accident with an e-bike and was in a fire. And we are trusting the government that they are safe, but they are not. They need to be regulated, they need to be checked. Change the rules to save someone's life. My life has been ruined, but I can save someone else's.
So, as you can see from this, the challenge we've got is lithium-ion batteries. There's perhaps one of the the worst examples in terms of risk profile of e-mobility devices you'll find out there, which is people building their own e-bikes. Happens a lot. There's lots of reasons for it. But looking what actually happens, or why is it a problem? Lithium-ion batteries are used in everything, nearly everything that we use is rechargeable. It's great technology. You can get a lot of energy in a small space, but it is this which in fact makes them susceptible to damage through overcharging, physical damage, or just degeneration or malfunctioning because of poor quality products or poor quality manufacture. And in this type of situation, a lithium-ion battery can go into something called thermal runaway. It's a chemical chain reaction which you can't stop. It just keeps on getting bigger and bigger until you get a rapid release of a toxic vapor cloud, which is also explosive, followed by either fire or explosion. You say, well, why doesn't it happen more? Well, it is happening quite a lot. A lot of the products that we use, like phones, computers, even cars, they're very controlled in the way they're manufactured. E-mobility and e-bikes need.
So, thanks for joining once again, and welcome. We're gonna run through.
Quite variable in quality. They're susceptible to damage, and we store them and charge them in our living rooms. So this is why we're particularly at risk in terms of e-mobility devices and lithium-ion batteries. I think we've just covered this. Even a high-quality product will decline over time, and things like scooters impacting the ground, or people going out and buying a replacement battery which is not standard, not standard or compliant, not fitted with a battery management system, or getting a replacement charger, not an original manufactured product, increases the risk hugely of a thermal runaway event occurring. And that's one of the things which contributed to the story which we just heard. And so that's the cause of it. It could happen anywhere, really. Huge volumes of this toxic vapor cloud. If the battery's in a high state of charge, it'll probably ignite very quickly and get a very fierce fire with rocket-like flames. If it's in a low state of charge, the likelihood of there being an ignition is lower. But what this toxic vapor cloud is actually doing is forcing out the oxygen and developing an explosive environment. And there's been some really severe explosions with windows and doors blown out in that sort of situation. And it's almost impossible to actually put out. Generally, the fire service will put the battery in a bucket of water or something, still burning away, but it's sort of controlled, at least to an extent. So that's what happens. We have to keep updating this slide, to be honest. They're not isolated incidents. There have been 13 fatalities in the UK since 2020 and nearly 200 injuries. The London Fire Brigade have described it as the fastest growing risk on their watch, so to speak, and incidents are occurring now almost every day in the UK. So I guess this begs the question, really, what does this mean for us as specifiers? There's a question there at the beginning about whether we're going to cover legislation. In reality, there isn't actually much legislation yet to cover this. The approved documents, document S, electric vehicles, doesn't mention the word bicycle or scooter or personal mobility devices, none of that at all. There was some government guidance issued regarding covered car parks, fire safety guidance for electric vehicles written by Arup. And that's, again, specifically it's written around cars, and it says it doesn't include the light electric vehicles we just described. So I suppose the purpose of this is to start raising awareness and start having those questions that we ask ourselves and say, well, what actions should we start taking? What questions should we be asking? Who should we be going to for reference on this? As an overview, I think if we see from what we shared already, you really don't want a thermal runaway event occurring indoors. So if we can get an external storage facility, then that's clearly preferable. If it's internal, it has to be internal, there's no alternative to that, then it's much like an underground car park insofar as you want full 60-minute compartmentation, detection, suppression, fume extraction. And even if we're just putting in a power supply for charging, I think we need to be thinking about what the long-term implications of that are. One of the most recent bits of guidance was from the London Fire Brigade. Their guidance note 103, guidance principles charging and storage electric powered personal vehicles, as they call it, EPPVs. It is written for the requirements of the regulatory reform order, so people managing residential buildings rather than design, but I think it's still quite appropriate. I've just summarised some of those requirements here. Their overriding thing is, where possible, it should be stored and charged in a dedicated external location. Where you can't achieve that, then an internal store, it needs to be fully compartmented, not linked directly to a means of escape, provide automatic detection, suppression, smoke ventilation, and also consider the need for enhanced structural fire protection. Now, what I take that to mean is that some of the products that we may traditionally use for creating fire-resistant structures will not stand up to a thermal runaway event. There's been evidence of it tearing through 2 layers of plasterboard, for example. So we don't have all the answers here, but I think it's right that we pose the question and that we always sort of work through these bullet points almost in order to make things as safe as we possibly can. The other measures are more related to the management of the building, maintaining, selecting where they use, where they charge, and that sort of thing. But those first 3 points, or the first section, is very relevant to us as designers and specifiers. Another development is that Electrical Safety First are working to get legislation into Parliament, or were, and still will be at some point in the future as soon as they can, to get tighter controls over the sale of personal mobility devices, and also stronger recommendations around storage, charging, and so forth, and that's something that we very much support. So that's background in terms of e-bike, fire safety, fire risk. Very happy to field any questions on that, but for now I'll pass that back to Jayden to run through some of the specification areas. Okay, Jayden?
Good. Thank you very much, Nigel. Yes, that's a good background and an overview of what's happening. And I think that sort of forms a bit of context, I guess, to what we're going to run through now. And I guess we know well and good when, particularly when we're looking at new developments and schemes that we're on, the location of cycle storage and that type of thing is a question that comes up. Sometimes we'll be picking up a scheme where we've hardly got, you might say, the landscape space available to us to put them externally. Other times we will have. So it's trying to make sure we cover those bases, and what we're gonna just try and filter through now, if you like, is the strategy that's behind that. And ultimately the steps that we want to be working through as we put that back together, forming a plan. We'll have a little look at fire resistance as well, in the sense of what we can do now with a structure to be giving known levels of fire protection. And of course, part of this conversation, without a doubt, is how secure we keep and make ultimately the facilities that we're putting in. Now, on location, first of all, it would hardly be right for me to sit and talk about the location of a cycle store without perhaps suggesting that one of the first things we see very commonly is, and indeed is best practice, is where we're putting it for accessibility purposes for the intended users. However, I think probably more crucial to that really is, what actually is about safety long term, and if that means having to put a unit externally somewhere not directly next to the entrance of a building or something like that, then that probably is really what we want to prioritize. Now, just reference the NFCC guidance, and as it says here, for mobility scooters. I know it's in principle a little bit of a different use, but the issue, if you like, is exactly the same. It's charging batteries. And a while back they issued some very clear guidance stating out what we should, the principles ultimately that we should be following from a safe storage perspective. So you'll see the reference in there to saying, well, look, if we are having to put them internally, we must have really sort of full 60-minute fire compartmentation and all that goes along with that. But as Nigel referenced earlier on, and it is the best strategy to say we really want to get them outside the building. Now, what the NFCC gives is a very good headline of a 6-meter safety distance. So, literally speaking, if we are making a known charging provision, then we're keeping that outside of a 6-meter zone, unless we are able to fire rate that structure in some way. That's the next part, which I'll come on to in just a second. And of course, that immediately brings up that question that we referenced at the start of this bit, that we don't necessarily have that space available, and it's about looking at what alternatives we'll have to work through from a fire resistance specification point of view that we should be using. But as I say, we'll come back to that. And even linking in this point about security, where we locate it, a cycle store has quite a direct implication really in how secure that structure is. Many a cyclist will say, look, I don't actually want to leave my e-bike in there because I've paid $3,000 or more or less for it, and the risk of that being stolen is too high. Then of course I take it into the flat or the house with me, which, as we've just been running over, is the worst case scenario in many respects if things go wrong from a fire standpoint. So location in terms of what we call natural surveillance, might say in full view of residents' flats or an area like that does increase that. Whereas as soon as we're kind of hiding it, you might say from the wider public view, it restricts, you might say, attention of potential thieves and that type of thing. Now, on more of a practical point, the other thing, of course, is going to be, if we are, as I say, making this known charging provision, we want to be thinking about what the electrical supply to that is and locating it as close as we can to, and of course, new build, this will be planned in anyway as part of the overall strategy, but should it be more of a on an existing area from that point of view. Putting it close to landlord electrical supply, quite literally, is going to be keeping connection costs reasonable. Now, another point that just comes to mind as before I move on to the next part is that it is often said, well, how, particularly when e-bikes are brought in and out of a building, where perhaps there isn't a charging provision made, and actually it's very hard for whether it's building owners or residents and that type of thing to know what is and isn't coming in and out of that store area by way of LEVs. And of course, that is a challenge which comes back to what legislation we need to see and how this is going to be controlled. Anyway, moving on to the next part, which is of course then what we do from a fire resistant standpoint. So we then look at the scenario where we're saying, look, the only possible location is within 6 meters of a building. The very strong recommendation then is to be using something that's at least 30 minutes fire resistant. Now, we have tester units independently tested by the FPA to demonstrate that spec, so to speak, but regardless of what's used, that 6 meters is really your key headline, if you like, in that. And then if you're coming down to say within a 1 meter boundary, if you like, within a dwelling particularly, I think really including fire suppression and that type of thing is probably just as relevant and perhaps more so to limit damage also to other devices in the event of a thermal runaway taking place. And I think at that point it comes the question, and it's again something we can discuss in our little Q&A session at the end of this, but actually, where does this line stop and start? In the sense of we have to protect lives, that's paramount. But then be thinking about the other bikes within that store and the wider implication of that. So the more we can say we're limiting the spread of flame is key. Now I link this point about security in with this. Now, not directly bearing on this, but I think it's probably fair to say if we look at the two main challenges that the cycling industry faces on a whole, cycle theft and of course this with LEV fires is probably the two main things on the whiteboard, so to speak. And I think, as we've already referenced, many of these devices, particularly electric, are highly valuable. And it does come back down to, as we said, as much as possible actually encouraging users to use that structure that we've provided for safety reasons within the building. And I think that is the key here in this, really. And I think when you look at this whole conversation about security, I refer to it as really approaching it in different layers. In other words, how many layers of security can we be adding before we even look at the product? As we said, its location. Where is it? Is there a first line of defense, i.e. it's behind a locked gated area, or is it going to be open to the public? Has it got good natural surveillance? Is there CCTV coverage of the area? And a lot of those questions I think are worth looking into just as much as saying, okay, but what about the structure itself? And that's where this bit comes in. So we have obviously secured by design working in this remit a lot, covering everything from door frames to window frames, to cycle stores. So we work personally with Salt Secure, one of the third-party independent testing houses that are approved by Secure by Design. And realistically, as with all of the testing houses, LPS and PAS and others, they have their criteria that we work through. And for us, we work to both the Cycle Gold and Cabinet Silver accreditations, which sets at basically the same level as LPS 1175 level 3 upwards. And I think that is your key. Literally, you'll often see those codes referenced in Secure by Design specifications when they're detailing out, what they want seen in there. You'll often see that. So I think it's kind of key that we add that further layer on. That means, an enhancement, if you like, to an overall traditional structure. And I think, to repeat, as we've listed here, the point about where we then put it, and even CCTV coverage has an impact in this. And as I say, the why we're going over this is really because, if you like, it has a slightly more indirect impact on what happens with fires and the risk of more electric bikes being taken into buildings, into people's flats, which are unfortunately areas not only where it's the most high risk in terms of population, but also in terms of the materials in those environments. I mean, in terms of their combustibility and so forth. So that brings me to just look at a couple of solution bits and pieces, if you like. Talking of cost, again, you've got two sides to this. I think trying to do it, when we're saying, look, we know we're making an e-bike charging provision, trying to do that cheaply, if you like, is not really an option when we look at the risk presented to life, which is the main thing in this. But at the same time, I don't think the owner of that building, the landlord, whoever, shouldn't exactly be bearing the full brunt of the costs. And of course, we're making a charging provision, that question will come up as well. And in terms of how that's going to work, the payment scheme wise going forward, and we see a lot of the pay-as-you-go systems, particularly in the public realm, and I think applying that in principle to a a specific scheme, say in the housing sector or whatever, is relevant. Paying a rental basically, or maybe it's just added on to monthly fees that tenants are paying, and that type of thing. And of course, in the commercial environment, it can work in a similar context. When you're talking about putting in a fire rated, a fire resistant structure, we've popped this guide here of the 2 to 3K figure. That is obviously hugely dependent on a lot of factors in terms of install location, all that type of thing. But if we're just talking about what guides we should be applying in a conversation with clients and saying, we're making a provision, what does that need to look like? So when we actually then come on to say, well, what does something look like that is actually gonna be performing at quality levels of fire resistance, covering in 30 minutes, and that type of thing? And that's I'll just show you a couple of examples of how that might work and what that might look like. That is, you've got your locker, but within one communal structure, so to speak, but with individual portions of storage space for scooters, and I think, or bikes. And I think one of the things in that is that if we can have individual, whether it's in a unit like this or whether it's in literally individual units, having each of those pods, so to say, fire rated is a benefit, not only from what we've gone through, but also because we want to protect those other bikes within there. The other option, of course, would be to say, no, we fire rate the structure, but we leave the bikes open, so to say, in there with the charging points and so forth. And of course, as such, a lot of these structures you could be applying to the inside of say we're looking at basement storage, for example, for cycle storage, and we want to be sealing off an area where we're actually putting in chargers for bikes. That kind of strategy is really just as relevant to follow as following the 6 meter rule of thumb externally. So I wanted to kind of open up the floor a little bit now. We've run over the background, some of the strategy we worked through, what's going on, what we need to be getting to ultimately, and the thought process behind that. And I just wondered if there'd be some questions people might want to chuck into this. A couple of thoughts have popped on the screen here, which is worth discussion potentially, I think. And I just, any questions that people want to throw in or comments on these points here.
Yeah, that's good, Jayden. Have you heard of any insurers requesting specific sort of conditions and things in terms of where stores are located?
Yeah, that's a good point. It has come up for sure. And I think we one thing we've heard, isn't it, is about actually asking for 60 minutes fire rating and that type of thing. That's been an insurance stated, policy, I think. And I think probably on a bit of an individual insurers bringing that policy in, which is good. But of course, still not on a wider note legislation. Had you got more thought on what that could be or should be?
Not specifically, but I do know that they're following this whole issue very closely, and a number of them have started issuing some, initial sort of position statements on it, which I think is good for us and our clients to keep abreast of.
Yes, that's good.
I guess I've got a question. Hi, Jayden.
Hello, Romans.
In terms of 6 meter distance, but is there a requirement for the height of the enclosure in terms of? I know with some, for example, gas storage. I think there's like depending on the size of the containers, but sometimes it's like a 2 meter tall fire rated wall to protect from fire. Going any further, but I don't know if there is any such requirement. Like if you just built something obstructing the for the fire to jump over. I don't know. Is that a requirement, or do you actually need to provide an enclosure if it's outside?
That's a good question. As it stands, there's not specific guidance around it. The 6 meters really is if the device is there without any protection. So it might be in the open, it might be a wooden shed or a plastic shed or nothing that's actually going to provide you with additional level of fire resistance. But as soon as you bring it closer, obviously you've got to increase the level of protection. The general feeling with the fire industry, the fire design, science, fire engineers industry is that you want to enclose it to prevent the radiant heat effect, including the roof. So the height, therefore, is less essential. You really want to cover the sides and the roof. But it is quite important that you do allow significant ventilation so that this toxic vapor cloud can actually escape and not build up to an explosive environment. So it's difficult to actually do specific distances and measurements without looking at exactly what materials and things you're utilizing. But yeah, that's probably about as far as we can go at this point, I think.
Okay, thanks. Was that based on the mobility scooter guidance, or?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's based on mobility scooter guidance. Yes, great. Good point there from Walter. Do you want to say more on that, Walter, about it being the battery being the risk?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes, sorry. Yeah, my point is we think to protect the bicycle and keep far from the building when it's not the bicycle, but it's when the battery is in charge, more at risk. Why we not provide something where people can charge at the battery in a safe place, and the bicycle can be stored whatever you want. Why not inside the house if someone need it? Or the scooter, I mean, is so small.
Yeah, no, it's a very valid point. You could do that. The risk is increased while it's charging, but it still exists at other times. So it's not limited to the period in which it's charging. So for that to work, the user would have to take the battery with them, or they'd have to put the battery in a safe charging area every time. Every time they parked it up, every time they came back to the building. In practical terms, one of the points then is, well, are they actually going to do that? Or are they going to leave the battery on the bike? If it's a mobility scooter and it's an elderly resident and quite a big battery, would they actually be, there could be issues around them actually being able to remove and carry that battery. So it's a very valid point. But when you apply it in actual practice, it becomes quite difficult to actually, for us all to be sure that that's actually going to happen and the risk is going to be managed and reduced.
Yeah,
does that make sense, Georgia?
Yeah, my thought thinker is also, I mean, where you store it, your bike, you don't have a point of charge of your battery, do you? I don't think so, because how you can control or who is pay for the charge of the battery. So anyway, you now stop someone to take the battery inside the house to be charged after bring back the bicycle or whatever. I mean, where you storage the e-scooter or the e-bike, you don't have a point for charger.
Yeah, I would expect there to be one. I have seen a number of instances where that is the case.
Yeah.
So we've got an underground car park, we've got a closed off area for all the bike racks, and periodic intervals where there's a power point, people have plugged in their chargers for their electric bikes and their mobility scooters and cargo bikes and all sorts of, you know, different devices. So clearly it will vary from building to building. I guess the important thing is, look, we've got to make sure that we do actually find a way of doing this and doing it safely. Now, whether that's by separating the battery from the device or leaving it together, wherever we charge it, there's a risk, and we can't have that. You know, it needs to be protected. But it's not just when we're charging; it's when we're storing. Even if it's not being charged, if it's in storage, this could still happen. There's been plenty of cases of it happening when they're not on charge. So yeah, there's points to be aware of there, I think. And Silka's made a great point there that quite a lot of devices you can't actually remove the batteries. So might work in some instances, but don't think it's going to work everywhere.
Thanks.
And of course, another point in that could be, Nigel, just thinking that I don't know how many councils have yet said we want a capacity of e-bike charging points provided. And of course, I guess some of it is probably more based on client request or developers sort of adding features, if you like, to storage facilities. Probably all the more important that that's got a measure of control around it. Do you think?
Yeah, it is important. I mean, how are the guys on the call? Are you getting requests for it, or how's it? Are you getting more requests for e-bike storage?
Getting requests, but internal space is quite precious, so it's frequently externally.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And have out of interest, Romans, have councils come back to you saying, you know, we want so much of this to be with a charging space, so much of it to be standard storage, you know, that type of thing? Is that sort of conversation come through?
The projects I worked on, a university kind of guided us in provision of e-bike and regular cycle store, but I don't believe that we don't have a charging point there. Yeah, it's just the space provision for cycle store.
I think we've had that for cars quite a lot of rate, but not so far, I don't think, for e-bikes. But we are providing storage for e-bikes at the job we're doing just now, or will be. The biggest concerns mainly through the fire issues and that kind of thing. So
yeah. No, you're right there, Aaron. I think I'd probably add.
I think for Hucknall we have internal buggy store it's a care home, so it's for old people's buggy. 60 minutes fire rated wall, but we don't have any charging provided inside, I think.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think they're going to charge it then?
No idea.
Presumably for that, could that be charged just directly off a conventional 13 amp socket for that type of vehicle? Is that?
Yes, it can. Yeah. No, it can. I was just going to come back to your point there, Alan, about electric cars as opposed to light electric vehicles, e-bikes and so forth. And although they're smaller units, smaller batteries and so forth, I actually think the risk is higher. We covered off earlier that there's less control over the sale. So you could be bringing in sort of bikes of very poor quality, batteries of very poor quality.
Yeah.
They're also more susceptible to damage. So, you know, just in normal use, even, you know, crunching up and down curbs or just continual vibration or impact, the actual likelihood of an incident occurring is much, much higher. So although at the moment government sort of trying to sort of play down the risk, and I can understand why, in actual fact, it's almost more of a risk than it is at cars, to be honest. So definitely something we need to think about very seriously.
I was just down in Luton, so the Luton airport, and of course, immediately when the fire was at the car park down there, everybody thought, oh, it's an electric vehicle. Of course, found out has turned out that was not the case. It was actually a conventional diesel vehicle, but the immediate thought was initially it must have been an electric vehicle that had caused this, but it was false. So.
Yes, well, look, we're not trying to demonise electric vehicles or electric bikes in any sense of the word. I drive one myself, but and I think standards in terms of cars is very high indeed. But personal mobility devices, as I say, it's quite a different matter, especially people building their own and that sort of thing. And as a building owner, you've got no real control over what the residents might bring into the building. I think that's the biggest concern. I think, well, how do we deal with that?
Yeah,
absolutely. Donald, great comment there about increased risk of charging, increased when fast and rapid charging. And I think, yeah, that is true. You're putting a lot more strain on a battery when you're charging it quickly. And this is all good when you've got a quality product that's in good condition and using the correct charging device. It's if somebody buys something non-standard, something incompatible, you haven't then got the BMS function, the battery management system or safety function, which reduces the charging input as if the temperature starts to climb. You haven't got that, and so there is absolutely a very similar concern. If it's a good product, it's been used properly, there shouldn't be an issue. But it's the ones that don't have the appropriate controls, either they weren't manufactured with it or something's been changed, modified, amended through the life of the product, used incorrectly. And that's when we can get into this thermal runaway situation. So, yeah, they're great products, great pieces of kit, but they do need to be used with respect, used with care. You know, even charging a car, it will start off at 200 odd kilowatt hours, but it will gradually slow down because that's all it's doing. It's managing the heat, it's managing the energy, that's within the battery. If that's not happening, even with a small battery, we can get a really serious incident. Any other points, any other contributions people want to throw in there?
Some good
points.
Main thing
I would say is, sorry, go on, Jayden.
No, you carry on. I was just saying some good points made.
The only point I would make is to come back to this electrical safety first campaign. Whilst can't exactly ask our members of parliament to support a bill that's not there yet, or even members of parliament that aren't there yet. As soon as it does come live, please do all you can to support it, because it is really important that we start getting some clear guidance on how we should be dealing with this risk. And yeah, really appreciate everyone's interest in this important subject. Even though there's still a lot of moving parts, we don't have all the answers to this yet. So from me, thank you very much.
Thanks, Nigel.
Yeah, and thank you from me too. It's good. Most of you through registration to this session will have got my email, but if it's a question of saying, look, this is coming up on a project for me now, what do we do? Then we're very happy to work through that with you and look at the suitable spec that suits to. So recording will make available along with slides and that type of thing. I'll drop a line to you with that. So thank you. Unless there's any other questions that people want to throw in, but thank you for joining on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll speak sometime.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Andrew. No problem.